Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to be diving into the Flask system rework featured in patch 3.15 and how it's going to drastically change how we build our characters and progress in the game. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the Flask system rework features some quality of life updates, which everyone's been asking for, but also some heavy nerfs to the Flask system we know and love. Let's start off with quality of life. So in terms of quality of life, Grinding Your Games has added 2 brand new currencies to the game. How are these going to impact how we play? Let's get into it. So the first one here is the Enkindling Orb. This one essentially makes it so that you are unable to gain Flask charges during your Flask's duration, but you gain a significant amount of power. So in the example we have here, which is the only example we have so far, you get around 50% increased Flask effect, but you cannot gain charges during the effect. This is a massive deal when we get to the nerfs, but this is a very sizable increase in power. So for example, if you take a Flask like Dying Sun and you have no Flask effect and you had 50% increased effect, you would essentially go from 2 projectiles from Dying Sun to 3, which is incredibly potent. Now, in a mapping scenario, you do not want this modifier on your flasks. It's going to interrupt the flow of mapping, and it's going to turn your flasks into pseudo cooldowns, which is not really what you want during mapping. You want a consistent experience, and overall, I think that people will not be going for the Enkindling Orb in any mapping scenario, and it's exclusively going to be for bossing, introducing the scenario in which you may want a bossing set of flasks and also a mapping set of flasks, which could definitely be something people pursue. But overall, I think the Enkindling Orbs, while extremely powerful in some cases, most people are going to shy away from them because that is an incredibly large penalty and is really only suitable for bossing scenarios or very specific builds who want a Flask, on cooldown and on demand, which is very few of them. Alright, next up. The Instilling Orb is the opposite arm to an Enkindling Orb. It offers no additional power, but it does actually offer some quality of life and also some reaction, sort of buffs. So the Instilling Orb essentially allows you to modify your flasks with trigger conditions. So trigger conditions are stuff like, cast and damage taken, but instead of casting, it uses your flask. So you can see here, use when you become shocked. This is fairly powerful. It allows you to basically immediately defreeze, de-bleed, or anything like that, meaning you wouldn't have to do that by yourself. Now this is fairly counterintuitive though, because with the traditional Flask piano we currently use, we're just permanently immune to all of these things, and it's not really going to make sense why you'd want to only trigger your Flask when you're shocked until we get to the nerf section, but fair enough, you can do it. There is a specific mod though that makes this quality of life orb make sense, and that is the modifier that reads and is mentioned by Chris Wilson in the Q&A that a flask triggers when an adjacent flask is used. So essentially, if you have all of your flasks with that modifier and you use one of them, they will all trigger, essentially allowing you to have a flask macro within the rules of the game, meaning you only need to press one flask to use all of your flasks, which is essentially what people have been asking for since the dawn of time, which is definitely pretty popular, and I think it's a very good change, and I'll certainly be rolling all of my flasks when I can get around to having the currency for it to have this modifier when I'm in a mapping kind of scenario. So pretty cool there in my opinion. Now, those are the quality of life changes. So you essentially get a free flask macro if you want to invest in rolling that on your flasks. You also have the option to trigger specific flasks at specific times when you get bled, when you get on low life, for example, etc. But the limitation to this is that you can't use it on life and mana flasks, which is actually a pretty big deal. So you can't, for example, have a instant life flask, which triggers when you're on low life, giving you basically pseudo one-shot kind of prevention. That is not a thing, and that actually is a pretty big deal. So it's just utility flasks, really limiting the scope of the defensive abilities of these currencies, unfortunately. Alright, so let's get into the nerfs. So we got a bit of quality of life. It's pretty good. The main one really is the trigger when you have adjacent flask, which is the flask macro. But when you get to the nerfs, things start seeming, you know, a little bit less awesome. Let's just say that. So overall, Grinding Gear Games has made it fairly clear that their objective is to continue to nerf the end game metagame of Path of Exile until it's in a state which kind of aligns with their vision for PoE 2. And Flasks, being one of the most powerful ways to augment and power up your character in the game, seem to have definitely caught their eye this time around. So overall, Flasks have probably completely been annihilated from most points of view. And I think the prime example of this is the Basalt Flask. So the Basalt Flask traditionally usually gives you percent physical damage mitigation, one of the most powerful stats in the game, and one of the reasons you would play Pathfinder and be so tanky. Using a Basalt Flask could give you, like, you know, 30 to 40% physical damage mitigation for physical on these classes, which stacked flasks, and it would essentially allow you to kind of, you know, tank physical damage very effectively. Now, this has just been completely removed. It is no longer there. Previously, they had nerfed the Basalt Flask, but this time they just completely deleted the flask pretty much and reintroduced a new flask under the guise of Basalt. So that's kind of how serious they are about nerfing flasks. And you can kind of see this across the board. The Jade Flask, for example, sorry, the Stibnite Flask, for example, went from 100% increased evasion, which is incredibly powerful at low amounts of invasion and low amounts of gear. So like when you're leveling up, you know, when you don't have to invest too much into evasion, incredibly powerful, to a 20% more evasion multiplier, which is, it rewards you more on the top end, but it's significantly less powerful on the lower end. You know, so those builds that use Queen of the Forest and stuff like that to get evasion capped, I'm not entirely sure on the math, but it may actually be a nerf for you on the Stibnite as well, and that is kind of pretty brutal. I am very concerned about my good friend the Quicksilver Flask. I can't see him present, and I definitely want to see what they're doing to him, because it seems like one of their priorities is to slow down the game, and one of the biggest abusers of clear speed is the Quicksilver Flask, in some cases giving characters upwards of 100% increased additional movement speed, so it wouldn't surprise me if Quicksilver Flask is absolutely hammered. Alright, moving up. They have also introduced some new flasks, but across the board, I would expect the most powerful flasks to be completely nerfed into oblivion. So stuff like Bottle of Faith, Dying Sun, Cinder Swallow, you know, basic Lion's Roar. Anything that is incredibly potent, I expect to take a heavy nerf, and you'll see what I mean. They're definitely not holding back on that regard. Alright, so let's get into the nerfs. So this is going to be all based off of the interview with Chris Wilson and the Q&A, and of course everything is, you know, subject to change, and maybe I misinterpreted some of the information. But from what I understood from the interview, he has mentioned that monsters in the game will yield 75% less flask charges overall. That's what he's mentioned, and overall that is an absolutely colossal nerf. So it is basically 4 times less flask charges in maps. Will this lead to you no longer being able to sustain your flasks? It is fairly unclear. I would probably say it would push you over if you're not doing super juiced maps super duper fast to the point where you couldn't sustain, for example, your Quicksilver Flask as well without flask duration, which would make it so that you would be a little bit more uncomfortable and clear speed would be significantly hindered. And in some cases, if you're using defensive flasks, they may fall off in some cases, so stuff like Curse Immunity and the like that. So definitely a little bit of a heavy hitter there. But the thing that really pushes it over the edge is the double tap here. They didn't just modify how many charges you get in maps, they also made it so that the actual flasks themselves contain more charges. So if you take the Stibnite here, for example, we can quickly look up the Stibnite online, and we can take a look at, oh, that's a crystal. We can take a look at the Stibnite Flask online, and you can see how many charges it has. It has 30 charges. In this example, subject to change, it has 60 charges. That is double the amount of charges. So they nerfed the actual accumulation of charges by 75%, so you're getting 25% of what you had, so you need 4 times more charges. And then they also increased the container by double, so you need now have a maximum of 60 charges. And they also quadrupled for the Stibnite Flask how many charges it consumes. Which is completely insane in my opinion. So they basically made it so you can only use 1 Stibnite Flask per kind of like, I guess, like container of it. I guess that's what you would describe it as, versus 3. And it's just like an absolutely monstrous nerf. So it's like, if you actually do the math on it, I'm sure someone will, it is incredibly powerful nerf to the old Flaskaronies. But the thing which really has me curious is how this is going to fit in with Pathfinder. So Pathfinder and the Ascendant Pathfinder nodes traditionally have been incredibly powerful and build defining. Having the ability to have basically infinite flasks and always have them on, and having one of the most powerful mechanics in the game be flasks, has really defined Pathfinder as an ascendancy, and it's made it incredibly fun and unique to play. Overall, though, the thing that really makes Pathfinder click and work is, in fact, the fact that it gains 3 charges every 3 seconds. And this is modifiable by things on the tree. Example, let's just say you get 5 flask charges per 3 seconds. With the new buffed amounts, that is no longer as impactful. So before, every 2 ticks, you used to get a Stibnite Flask kind of use, and combined with Ascendancy and also passives on the tree and on like the belt and stuff like that, you used to basically essentially be able to go infinite on your flasks. Well, unfortunately, that is probably, with current values, not going to be the case unless they buff Pathfinder or adjust it to the point where it is actually able to do that. I think that Pathfinder being able to sustain flask was incredibly cool, and I would actually like it to continue to be able to do that, and maybe be the only class that can really do that. That would be quite unique. But overall, Pathfinder, I hope, gets some adjustments. Otherwise, it's going to languish in the fairly undesirable position of not being able to use its main mechanic, which is not great. Okay, so, well, let's move on to the next nerf. So the next nerf is, in fact, to Ailment Immunity in relation to flasks, and this is where the kind of triggers come into effect. This is probably the biggest change of the entire patch that they've revealed so far. So ailments in Path of Exile are incredibly deadly, ranging from completely disabling your character to making you take way more damage. And basically most characters completely mitigate this through the use of flasks in the early game and mid game. You know, you can sort of get into some pretty advanced tech later on, or you can pick an ascendancy that gives you ailment immunity, but for the most part, for stuff like bleed, shock, and all sorts of stuff like that, you do heavily rely on flasks, at least in the softcore environment. Now, there is the change coming in that now flasks no longer grant you immunity at all. They essentially just remove the debuff, and if you do successfully remove a debuff, it gives you 1 second of grace where you can no longer have that debuff applied to you. Versus the incredible like duration and flat out blanket immunity we have right now on Flask, this is a colossal change. And it's going to make ailments, curses, and all sorts of stuff like that a massive deal to deal with early on and overall in the game. Flask will no longer be a reliable way to do and get around that. They will probably be the only way that you can really have access to it early on, and you probably will go with, you know, remove freeze, but it's not going to be anywhere near as good a solution as it used to be. And in the really end game, when you have tons of monsters going on, you have like Deli and all sorts of stuff like that, just throwing garbage at you with tons of ailments, it's definitely going to be felt. And I don't think that 1 second combined with the 75% nerf and combined with the increased flasks flask charges used, and like the overall increase in flask consumption to be able to even activate the flask, it's going to feel very, very consistent. So overall, I think that blanket immunities are pretty much axed. We will have to see and play to feel how that actually turns out. But overall, I am definitely a little bit worried personally about my league start and how I'm going to play around these big changes. So very, very spooky, I suppose, is what you would say. So overall, I think that the Flask rework did introduce some quality of life, but the massive nerfs are definitely a little bit concerning, especially if you like to play Pathfinder, and a lot of builds really do rely on Flasks as their main way to scale damage or their main way to scale quality of life. For example, bow builds rely on Dying Sun. I have no idea what's going to happen to Dying Sun, but you know, if it loses its projectiles, that is a massive hit to certain build archetypes, and that was a very unique drop off of the Shaper as well, and that is pretty much primarily one of the only reasons you would farm Shaper outside of his Uber Elder fragment, and losing that would make Shaper lose a lot of his identity. So there is definitely a lot of concern around the Flask rebalance. Cinder Swallow similarly is an incredibly important Flask for clear-based builds, and losing access to that, or as having it as powerful, definitely will be felt, as it is pretty much the primary source of sustain for most mapping builds, whether that be mana, energy shield, or life. It is very, very powerful for a lot of builds, not only as damage, but also as defense. So overall, I am very, very interested to see how this Flask rework will go over. I think overall the player base is going to struggle to adjust early on until we have a pretty good idea of how we can navigate, like freeze and all sorts of stuff like that. Flask probably will be pretty good still. They will still serve the problem, but I expect to die a lot more to stuff like, getting chain frozen, or, maybe getting double ignited, like ignited, my immunity flares off and then I get ignited again. But pretty much the way I'm going to go into it is to play like I traditionally did, all the same flasks I traditionally did, and see how it feels. I'm going to make use of the new instilling orbs to kind of make a bit of a pseudo flask macro for myself. But outside of that, we will just have to see if everything kind of goes all up in arms. We may need to look into getting Ailment Immunity in other places, which could impact meta diversity. If the only place to get significant Ailment Immunity is through your Ascendancy, you may see an awful lot of Elementalists and Raiders, as well as, maybe Inquisitors, I believe, also have it, and Silence. But overall, we shall have to see. It is a massive nerf. I don't know if it was worth it, and we may still see a little bit of Flask pianoing going on in our future. It's my guess. But overall, it's just a waiting game. So with all that said, guys, hope you guys enjoyed this little bit of an assessment of Flasks. If you guys want me to cover other topics next, let me know which ones you guys want to be seeing next. I do have a massive opinion on all of the new skills. If you want to understand the viability of them in the new meta, let me know, and I'll cover those as well. With all that said, guys, hope you guys have enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.